Lina Brocka didn't approach cinema from an aesthetic point of view, I don't think. He didn't want to produce work of, high artistry in those terms. What he wanted to do, I think, is more to do with social confrontation. He's drawn to a kind of filmmaking which opens up social issues, which does so in such a way that it makes them provocative and forces the audience into making moral decisions about things. Lino Brocka was a singular figure in that, unlike most Filipino directors, he had had some college education. He had further even been a missionary. And he was whisked off to the west coast of the United States. He didn't get on very well with the Mormon church authorities. He questioned things too much. I think that seems to have been the consensus. And he was eventually sent off to the leper colony in Molokai in Hawaii. During this period, he, I think, selflessly served the lepers, but he also redefined himself in some ways. And then he returned to the Philippines in the late 1960s. So Lino started working for production companies in 1970, and he made a string of films, quickies you'd call them, I guess. And Lino came to this from working with a theatre group for underprivileged kids called PETA, the Philippines Educational Theatre Association. And Lino rapidly became a significant force in it, particularly in its Manila branch. The Philippines was in a state of some turmoil in the 1970s. Marcos, dictator-to-be, had been elected president with his famous, if not notorious, wife Imelda. And Marcos had, in 1972, declared martial law. It was partly political opposition and insurrection of various kinds, but it was also a sense that there was a pervasive lawlessness in the Philippines. Martial law basically was designed to knock out some standard legal processes so that it was possible for the president and his people to act more peremptorily. They could do what they liked, essentially, in the way of controlling people. So at the time, the cultural climate was pretty constrained. Lino hated censorship. He hated people controlling each other in an authoritarian way and saw the need to resist that in every way possible. I mean, the seeds were sown, let's say, of his later social and political activism in that period because he was openly and publicly opposed to martial law. In 1974, he and a few other friends, at least one of them from PETA, which was Mario O'Hara, the actor, later to be director and also writer, became the founders of a new company called Cine Manila. A commitment to Filipino cinematic artistry and relevance was their slogan on their handout at the time. Because in the Philippines, there was no tradition, really, of what we might call now art house cinema. Take, for example, the beginning of their kind of manifesto text. The plots of film stories were invariably simplistic, character motivations not psychologically sustained, acting superficial, photography and editing roughly done. And the impression created was that life is one-dimensional, either black or white, tears or laughter, success or failure. The common term of dismissal was that films were aimed at the bakya crowd. Bakya are a kind of wooden clog worn particularly in the provinces, which means those rather unsophisticated, uneducated, low tastes, and most films were indeed aimed at such audiences. Cine Manila were not trying to break with the mass audience in any sense at all. On the contrary, they wanted to make films that would reach the mass audience, but they wanted to reach them in a more sophisticated way. They were simply trying to improve it and still fit into the kind of tastes that the audiences that they were targeting had. So, under this banner, they make two films. The first film, Wade and Found Wanting, sort of did that. It was a very auspicious beginning, and it was seen as a watershed work in Philippine cinema of the 1970s. My own view is that the second Cine Manila production, 321, the three-episode film, is more sophisticated, better, and more interesting in many ways. I thought that was an ambitious undertaking, and I thought it was executed with quite a degree of skill and success. However, this more ambitious film, the second film, failed to find the same degree of popularity and approval from the mass audience that the first one had done. And Cine Manila died almost as soon as it was born. However, at this point steps in a man called Mike de Leon, or to be very precise, Miguel de Leon, but known universally as Mike. Mike de Leon was the heir to a Filipino film company called LVN. He had studied abroad, and he'd come back as a practicing cinematographer, and he had the idea of doing something similar himself. So he started another new company, which he called Cinema Artists. And it was Mike de Leon's idea to make this film, Manila in the Claws of Light. Mike de Leon had found the source material. It's a novel by Edgardo Reyes, based on Reyes' own experience. Reyes was an educated man, but he had also worked as a laborer, had been effectively down and out in Manila, and he was keen to chronicle the kind of lives that people around him had experienced. Mike de Leon turned to a close collaborator, a man called Clodoaldo del Mundo, known to everyone as Doy del Mundo, to write the script based on this book by Reyes. And because of what had been achieved at Cine Manila by Lina Brocka 1 year earlier, it was handed to Lina Brocka as a potential project. Lina read it, was immediately intrigued by it, and of course this was on the rebound from the failure of his idealistic company. And he said, okay, but the script needs work. What he didn't like was the literalism of the script. He found that there were entire pages of dialogue, conversations reported, which were taken pretty much verbatim from the book. And he said it's not at all cinematic. So he wanted it streamlined, made much more succinct, much more visual, much more dramatized in terms of the interrelationships between the characters. And he changed a number of other things too. My understanding is from Lino that the novel begins with Julio killing somebody for purely self-interested reasons. Lino pointed out this was not viable dramatically. You can't do this because it would compromise the entire journey of the character in the film. If he starts out morally, bankrupt from the opening scene because he's committed a murder with impunity, who is going to care about him? This was Lino's position, and he expressed it forcefully first to Mr. Reyes, the writer, and second to Doy del Mundo, the screenwriter. So that element of the film was, the script was dropped. Lino added Manila to the title, and he spelt it in the Filipino way with a Y, Maynila, so that it became assertively local and assertively specific. He wanted it to be not just about workers attracted to the big city like moths to a flame, which is the metaphor that underpins the title of the novel and the subtitle of the film, but specifically a picture of Manila as it was in 1975, as the film was being made. He wants the geography of the city to be precisely rendered. He wants all the sociological details and the location of people's homes to be very exact and very precise. We have to stress, lest anybody misunderstand this, Lino's day job was making commercial films in the Philippines, and he churned out quite a number of what used to be called program pictures. I mean, films basically to satisfy the companies. Popular melodramas, mostly derived from comics. Comics in the Philippines didn't mean superhero comics. It meant mostly melodrama comics. It meant torrid tales, I mean, very much like soap opera on American daytime television. So every so often, when the chance presents itself, he makes a more ambitious film, which tonally would be reminiscent of the kind of films he saw when he was a kid, starring the likes of John Garfield, who's the name that he frequently referred to as sort of exemplar of the kind of films he liked when he was a kid. And Lino said in many, many interviews that he was a big film fan from childhood and that he saw mostly American films. Lino made probably half a dozen films that he thought had some meaning and some value. And in each case, the guiding spirit behind the films was probably that of film noir. For Lino, it was more a thematic issue. I think it was more the sense that what he liked in film noir was not so much the heritage of German expressionism in the images, it was the sense that the characters were entrapped, the sense that the characters were caught up in a situation that was only partly of their own making, life being cheap. There can be no easy way out of this. There is no happy ending possible.
Siya nga pala, kumusta sila sa probinsya?
Ewan.
Alam mo, siguro nakasulat na ako sa kanila mga 3 beses na. Nagpadala ako ng pera. Kasi hindi naman ako pinahawak ni ate ng pera eh. Pinibigyan lang ako pag kailangan ko na.
Alam ba nila?
Sa probinsya. Hindi.
I would say that the whole theme of impoverished, uneducated, no-hopers from rural areas heading to the big city and then finding themselves corrupted by big city life is the archetypal third world cinema theme. It was widely assumed that the plight of the uneducated masses could best be dramatized by showing a real sociological phenomenon, which is people from the countryside moving to the city and being screwed up by it in some way, having a terrible time, being morally compromised, being debauched in some cases, being and often killed, I mean, often chewed up and spat out by the system of the city. The same story could be told today, as was told in 1975 at the time that this film was made, which is that a lot of provincial kids coming from no-hope villages with no jobs available to them and dying industries like the fishing industry, which has been hit very hard by pollution in the seas, come to big cities like Manila looking for jobs. They have nowhere to live, they have no skills, they have no education to speak of, they have no formation behind them, so there's no obvious position they can walk into. And the reason that they end up first and foremost in the construction industry is because they are basically laborers.
Ako ho'y lumapit sa inyo nung nakaraang linggo. Sabi ho niyo, bumalik ako ngayon eh.
Nakapagpiyong ka na ba?
Oo,
Saan?
sa Cubao ho. Malapit na humayari yung building eh. Hindi na ho nila kailangan ng piyon.
O sige, may trabaho ka na. Ayoko ng tamad, ha? Taos 50 ang gana mo.
And then the second is going to be the sex industry, because the one thing they have to sell is their body.
Welcome to Sierra, the house of pleasure. Bobby! Tuloy ka, ang beauty ka yung dala mo. Sino ba yan? Halika dito, dali. Halika dito, tuloy, Bobby.
Lino added the scenes in the gay bar and the gay brothel. Those were not in the book. And Lino did it for a number of reasons. He said, well, Ligaya, his girlfriend, has been prostituted. It's important, especially when they get to spend their one night together in the motel, that they each know what it means to have been defiled, which is a very sensible answer.
Okay, ba?
But the corollary of that is that this is also very truthful. Because Lina was gay and was perfectly happy to take part in a certain level in the, I guess we'd have to call the sex industry of Manila, that he was quite familiar with this world, knew people in it, was friendly, in fact, with some people who ran elements of it.
Thank you, pare.
The sociological reality is, yes, a huge number of young men, especially provincials who come to the big city, do end up working in the gay industry, being gay for pay, because it's a way to earn money.
Huwag ka mag-alala, pare. Baka akala mo, bakla ako. Baka yun ang iniisip mo. Trabaho ko yun. Callboy.
Anong callboy?
Callboy. Alam mo siguro yung mga babaeng nagbebenta ng kanilang mga katawan. Mga puta. May mga lalaki ring, ano ba may tatawag sa kanila? Puto. Parang hindi ko gagawin ito, makakaabot ba ako rito?
When Lino added this element to the script, he was not, I think, pandering to his own sexuality or the desire to deal with that. He was just reflecting a sociological truth, which the straight writer of the novel had not taken on board because it was a closed book to him. It was not a closed book to Lino.
Ba't ka narito?
Lino is not by any means the first to go into these areas. However, it's rare, it's exceptional. It was never the mainstream.
Pare, may natira ka ba ng pera? Kailangan ko lang eh. May exam ako bukas. Wala akong pambiling exam book eh.
Hindi, kunin mo muna ito. 3 piso.
Paano ka naman?
Bahala na.
The film is guided by Julio's quest. Most of the people he comes close to and the people who give him places to sleep when he's thrown out of the construction site are all people with very similar backgrounds to him. He forms a kind of solidarity with them, and the film is partly about that. In fact, the film is clearly arguing from a leftist point of view that these people's best hope is to support each other, to get along together. So it's a kind of soft socialist message.
Bakit sa Maynila ka pa magtatrabaho?
Pagbigyan na natin ng inay, Julio. Saka sabi ni Mrs. Cruz, pag-aaralin daw niya ako sa Maynila. Ayaw mo ba nun?
The romantic flashbacks to the province, the fishing village where he knew Ligaya, those images are a weakness in the film. I think that he falls back into shampoo commercial cliche in those images, which tend to a little bit, rather easy kind of romanticism. Ligaya Paraiso is an extremely symbolic name. It means happy paradise, it literally means, which is not wildly convincing as a sobriquet. One can accept that this is perfectly acceptable shorthand to say something. It may be cliched, but it's still valid. It's quite consonant with, Philippine cinema in the mid-1970s. I think Lino thought of himself first and foremost as a Filipino filmmaker, and his audience was the Philippines. He wanted to have an effect in the Philippines to draw attention to the plight of his home country. That's what I think is special about Brocka's film. Anything that drags us back to reality and provides a kind of bedrock of sociological believability, credibility, and then builds on that with stories that expose, dramatize the reasons for oppression, the reason that it's difficult to get a voice heard, the reason that it's difficult to challenge overt corruption. Those issues, which are what you find in Brocka films, are potentially very useful in a culture like the Philippines.